Wow, thank you so much, David and Nick. We're really grateful that you were able to join us today and to present on your study. It's very exciting and important information. And we're happy to host you as part of this series. So at this time, our speakers will address your questions. I must say I've already seen a few of those questions popping up. So please submit your questions using the chat feature in WebEx. Questions are being compiled, and David and Nick will address as many as time will allow. So we will, you know, I was taking notes actually as I was seeing some questions already popping up in the chat box. So I like to start off with that, even though David, you sort of addressed this issue, but several people on the line picked up on the fact that, you know, while you are summing, you know, adding up counts of pollution points, people definitely recognize that not all pollution points are the same in terms of their toxicity, in terms of the potential for exposure. And a question was raised, and then it sort of generated some extended conversation in the chat. Shouldn't the pollution scores that you develop be weighted by the degree of potential hazard?
That was a conversation that, you know, we worked with a group of different people. It wasn't just Nick and I. It was myself, another attorney at Greenlaw. We had a toxicologist, an environmental engineer, and we had quite a few conversations about ways that we could weight the pollution sources. But we couldn't figure out a way to do that that wouldn't be even more subjective than giving them all a value of 1. I don't know how to give a sort of risk assessment score or a value to, you know, a TRI release versus an NPDES or a Clean Water Act permit. I wish that there was maybe there is a way to do that we don't know about. And Nick, of course, you know, I want to get your perspective on this too. But for me, this was the most useful way to do it, and also it was all of these are almost all of them are legally enforced permits, and so it was helpful for me to look at you know, the legal issues surrounding those permits and saying, well, if we've got the #1 environmental justice hotspots and they have 55 pollution sources and 19 of them are air pollution sites, it raises a lot of questions for me about, well, what do we is this an area that we want to pinpoint when these air pollution sites are up for you know, getting their permits renewed, or if a new air pollution site is coming in. And I know, and again, that raises questions about, well, who's affected by the air pollution, because it's not necessarily just the people in that block. So we ended up in the end just coming up with, you know, settling on giving each one a value of 1.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on what David said. You know, we struggled a lot with the issue of weighting. And we ultimately decided that kind of this report and this model was almost more of kind of a first pass. We wanted to take the demographic information, we wanted to take the pollution information, plug it into the GIS, and, you know, first and foremost, just simply see if it worked. And, you know, we're coming. I realize this is kind of a risk-heavy audience, and we were coming at it more, not as much from a risk perspective, but more of a location perspective, if that makes sense. And so with the outputs that we got, the EJ hotspots, those are areas that we've identified that warrant further investigation. And so in that process, it could be going through and looking more specifically at exactly what kind of pollution points are in those areas. And, you know, by no means are we saying that in all of these blocks that we identified as hotspots are environmental justice issues definitely occurring, but it's more of these are the areas where the demographics and the pollution sources indicate issues could be at play, and they warrant further investigation. And then in the future, as we kind of update and tweak this model, that's something that we can certainly take into account. This is, we're not saying this is perfect by any means. It's a start and a foundation to build on and move forward from there.
Some additional questions about methodology. One question is stated here, would be curious to know if other spatial grid sizes were considered or tried. You guys used the 10 square kilometer, but what about 5 or 15?
Yeah, and that's, again, that's something that we did look at in kind of the initial phases of the project. And we did look at a larger grid. At one point we used a 20 square kilometer grid, and we realized that was too large. That covered too much of an area and didn't give us the resolution that we wanted. So then we ran it with a 10 square kilometer grid, and it gave us, we felt comfortable with kind of the number of hotspots that we identified based on that. And also, some of it is just kind of our local knowledge of the area and thinking about the Metro Atlanta area and how much 10 square kilometers actually covers in terms of different neighborhoods and different parts of the city. And we felt comfortable that the 10 square kilometer blocks, they capture, they're kind of more on the neighborhood level of the study area. But with the model that we developed in the GIS, it's very easy to substitute in a 5 square kilometer block. If we wanted to focus in, rather than looking at the entire 14 county study area, if we wanted to focus in on a single county or a single group of counties, then we could potentially use a smaller grid to give us a little higher resolution.
Another question here, did the study analysts consider econometric tools for analyzing the data set? And the comment in addition here said the graphs show a trend, but perhaps leave out a lot of high-impact quantitative results. And then additionally, the person states perhaps that spatial regression analysis would have also been appropriate. Did you guys consider that kind of an approach?
Yeah, David, I'll go and start off on this one.
Okay.
There's a lot that we talked about, and there's a lot that we thought about doing and debated about doing. We had somewhat of a time deadline on this, and with this being kind of more of a first pass, a 40,000-foot view of things, we wanted to kind of keep it simple to begin with. So there's certainly a lot of geostatistical analysis that we can do in the future, and there's a lot more statistical analysis that we can do on the numbers. But this is kind of the first pass of it, and then as we I think focus in on certain hotspot areas, and if we tweak the model and tweak this going forward, that's stuff that we'll definitely work on incorporating in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just say that part of the goal, we wanted to tell a complete picture if we could, and we certainly wanted it to be objective, because I don't want to focus on any areas if they aren't truly, or at least begin to focus on areas or draw attention to those areas unless we felt like they at least had the proper indicators to warrant further investigation. And I also wanted to be able to communicate this information to a variety of different communities. So when we talked about certain things like we talked about looking at green space and looking at the distance from railways. We talked about adding in cancer statistics and all these different things. It would become more difficult for me to communicate to a variety of different audiences, I think was part of the issue too. And it would also perhaps stray from the two goals were to be able to communicate it to an audience and also to be able to respond through reviewing permits and taking a kind of legal tactical perspective from it. Although I agree. I mean, I think that I'm not a risk assessor or a statistician, but I'm sure that some of those more complex methods or more thorough methods would be useful in addition to what we did.
I have another question for you. First, a nice compliment says, thank you for an excellent presentation. 2 questions. What was the response from the real estate community? And are you aware of anything comparable being done for rural regions of the state? Or other regions, other rural areas around the country?
There wasn't a direct response from the real estate community, and I think that might be telling about the areas that we highlighted. So when this was on the news at 6 o'clock, it was focused on an industrial area that was mostly populated by minorities and areas that we're not talking about areas where you've got people who are going to move out because they're worried that they're worried about pollution. These are communities that have been there for a long time, or likely aren't mobile. The most negative responses were to some of those areas that I identified, which were the ones that were a little bit more suburban or rural, that were surprising that they showed up. So the area up in Canton, as well as there's an area in Douglasville, which is a kind of suburban area, and those were mostly, I did get some negative responses, sort of vaguely questioning the methodology, but mostly saying that they disagreed with what we were saying, and that there were certainly other areas that we should have been focused on. But I don't recall getting a specific response from a realtor or from a realty organization. I'm not aware of any studies that are being done outside of the Metro Atlanta area. We actually struggled a lot with figuring out where we wanted or at least I did, where we wanted the study area to be, because Metro Atlanta can be defined as 8 counties, 12 counties, 28 counties. I think there's a census statistic where they use parts of Alabama even as parts of Metro Atlanta. So we narrowed it down to looking at areas that had a certain population density and determining that those were only suburban and urban areas. And luckily it was all contiguous together, so we didn't have to have gaps in the map. I know that there are other studies. Devin, you and I have discussed some of these that have been done on environmental justice across the country. I wasn't aware of any that had been done, at least locally around Atlanta. If there had been one done, we probably wouldn't have put all the resources into it if it would have been something that was relatively objective and recent. I think that and Nick can probably comment on this, as GIS is becoming more accessible to people, it's much easier to do these kind of analyses. And as he said, this format or the way that this study is designed can certainly be used in other places, and they can certainly change some things as well, but follow the basic framework.
As you're mentioning the other studies, a question that comes up: how accurate are these existing data sources, particularly about location of pollution sites? And when we were all talking earlier this week, I think you shared with us that perhaps in some cases state databases might indicate the location of a particular pollution source, but the community might be able to tell you, well, hey, that thing closed down a few years ago. So how are you all addressing that, or do you have plans to how shall I say, sort of ground truth some of the data sets that you're using?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that was something that I meant to bring up. I don't think I talked about it, but I meant to bring up when I was talking about some of the criticisms of the report. Which, the reason why I brought those up was because it's great to have hindsight, and you can see that now. So if someone is doing this kind of study again, or wants to know more about why our results were, how they came out, it's important to know the criticisms. But we definitely got some criticism from people who were saying, okay, you're telling me that there are 15 pollution points in my block, but I know that this factory is no longer operating, or this if I don't know if sometimes gas stations show up on the as air pollution sites or things like that. It wasn't that common, but there were definitely some occurrences where these sources were no longer included. And all I could say is that we had to rely on the public data that is out there, because if we looking at such a huge area, there was no way for us to go out and determine which ones were still active and which ones weren't. And so our response is that this is the data that's provided by the federal and state government, at least at the time that we did the study. And so we wish it was more accurate, but we were pretty thorough in making sure everything was included. I'll say that it definitely detracts from trying to give your presentation or to make a point, if you're trying to make a point, when someone in the audience says, well, that place closed down 3 years ago. Well, and you say, oh, well, okay, that changes things a little bit, because maybe this area wouldn't be showing up at the top of the list. I think what would be a fantastic thing to do with the study would be, 2 years later, so that would be next year, to be able to go in again and maybe make some value changes, but also to do some ground truthing of the data. If we had enough people who were interested in helping out with that, I think it's a possibility. Or working more directly with EPA and EPD to determine whether or not some of these facilities are no longer active.
Excellent, excellent. I have a question here. Did you ever try to add to the mapped information data on mortality or morbidity, and to see how feasible that could be? And particularly diseases that might be relevant to some of the pollution sources or the contaminants associated with some of these sites.
You want to take that, Nick? I know that we tried to look at
we briefly kind of looked at trying to incorporate some health or risk or the mortality data. We have a public health expert here in the office that we kind of worked with a little bit on it, and that was one of the things where I go back to kind of keeping it simple and keeping it basic. We did look at a couple of different cancer data sets, mostly from air toxics. But we realized when we downloaded the data in the GIS and displayed it over our study area, it was almost entirely uniform across the entire 14-county study area. And after kind of looking into the data some more, we realized that the primary drivers behind that weren't really industry, but more autos, car emissions. If any of y'all are familiar with Atlanta, we have awful traffic, and I think rank in the top 5 in the country in terms of traffic. And so when you look at our entire Metro Atlanta area, at least in terms of some of the cancer data from air toxics, it's almost entirely uniform across the entire area. Kind of at the edges of our study area, where it starts to get a little more rural, some of those values start to drop off a little bit, but that was one of those things that we decided to leave out, just because it was so uniform across the area. And that's, again, moving forward as we tweak and make edits to this model, we can look at incorporating some more. Trying to incorporate some more health and some more morbidity data, as long as we can get it on a fine enough scale that will help us in our goals.
Absolutely. Another question, would it make sense specifically to look at vulnerability or use a vulnerability framework when looking at or making a decision about what types of issues to include, I guess, in your model in the mapping, i.e. issues of exposure, issues around innate or external susceptibility, issues around coping and access. I wonder if they mean here potentially access to health care. As a way to, I guess, to identify what the key pollution points to look at or the key demographic variables to look at? It sounds like the person's curious about using or coming at this from a vulnerability perspective. You know, what's conferring vulnerability in the population?
You know, all I can say is, and Nick probably has a better response, but I think it would be interesting to do that, because then you could create, you know, maybe you would have a vulnerability. You know, we would look at demographics, look at pollution, and then look at vulnerability and put that into the equation, and it would play into which communities were identified as environmental justice hotspots. So if you've got an area where, you know, asthma rates are particularly high, or, you know, there's other public health data out there that I'm not sure what exactly is available, I think it would create a fuller picture. We would have to, of course, figure out a way to do that was, again, objective, and that didn't, I think, you know, outweigh some of the other things that we're interested in looking at as well, because, you know, our at least for our purposes, we wanted to draw attention to the issue and say, either look at this place and do further study and tell, you know, I think that this area should be analyzed to determine whether or not, you know, not only there are, you know, public health effects, but are there different ways that we can, you know, regulate pollution in this area. And you know, it's difficult, for my purposes at least, with legal cases, where, you know, I was more interested in getting the policies created as opposed to, you know, looking at necessarily the vulnerabilities. But again, it's certainly a part of the picture that we didn't look at.
I have a question about methodology. The comment is, demographic data is by census blocks, which can have varying sizes and shapes. How did you all allocate the demographic data to your square grid?
So in the initial allocation that we used, if a square block overlapped 2 or more census tracts, which especially in the center of Atlanta, the closer you got in the city, a lot of the census tracts were very small, and so a 10 square kilometer block could cover 3 or potentially even 4. In those instances, we took the average of all of the census tracts contained within that block, and that's the value that we used.
I have another question about the data set. Comment is, I would think that some of your variables would be correlated, such as percent non-white and linguistic isolation. If so, then counting each of these would be double counting this factor. Any comments, response to that?
There's probably some amount of truth behind that. I will say, for especially the demographic variables we used, you know, David especially, but we looked at some kind of past and previous studies that did kind of a similar thing in different geographic areas, and we looked at the variables that they used and incorporated, and I know that's where we pulled a lot of our demographic information from, was some previous studies that we looked at, and David can probably expand on that a little more.
Yeah, we definitely did. We looked at different studies that were being done out in California, and looking at a program that was being developed by EPA but that hadn't been released yet, and kind of tailored the demographic characteristics to the information that we wanted to know. I definitely wanted to know more information about linguistic isolation, because I think that definitely, you know, opens up a conversation about the way that environmental permitting happens and the way that we look at what an environmental justice community is. I'm sure that's correct. There probably was some double counting, but maybe not as much as you would think in Metro Atlanta. There's specific counties that definitely have a higher Asian and Hispanic population, but we're also talking about you've got areas in Atlanta that are 90% minority and have 98% or I'm sorry, only 2% linguistic isolation rates because they're mostly African American or second generation Hispanic or others. So I think it did come into play, but I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing for our study or skewed the results.
Okay. Another comment. It is not apparent how you use the number of violations in your study. They did not affect your counts, correct?
They did. So we looked at violations between 2008 and 2011, and that required us to really go through looking at the ECHO database, but also looking at confirming those things or looking at separate actions by the state agency when there was a consent order or consent decree or notice of violation, that type of thing. Each violation was included as a pollution point if it was not a technical violation. And again, that's probably the most controversial part of the study, and we went back and forth about whether we should include the violations. But again, this study is a little bit different because it's not necessarily as focused on risk as it is on legal, looking at it from a legal perspective, because I wanted to know where the violations were occurring and whether or not they were happening more so in environmental justice communities. Were they happening repeatedly? What type of violations were they? Because that again could lead me in a certain direction with the work that I was doing, because citizens can bring actions if there are violations that are occurring and the state or federal government isn't responding in a way that we feel like is effective.
Do you have any additional thoughts about the problem of creating resentment among residents of the areas highlighted as hotspots? And is there anything you would do differently if you had to do it over again?
That's a great question. We were definitely concerned about that from the get-go. When we got the results out and we saw what we were going to be writing about and how, if you open up the report and you look at the environmental justice hotspots, the top 5 hotspots are actually, described in detail, and we name the cities and, what the problems are, and violations, of course, is a very controversial thing. We did send the report to community leaders. We had a list of all the different, people who were on city councils and anybody in the government, and sent it to them. We tried, I think, a week in advance of the report and said, we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about this and talk about our methodology, and we didn't want it to come out just out of nowhere and have the people feel like they were being mislabeled or attacked or something like that. Because it was such a large area, it was impossible for us to call everyone and say, hey, this is happening or this is coming up. And there really weren't environmental or environmental justice organizations or groups that exist in places like Canton or Douglasville. They're all focused in Atlanta, so it wasn't necessarily like we could go out and say, we want to get word out that this is an environmental justice issue in advance of this being released in the media. The responses were, pretty strong from these groups, that reacted to it. On the other side, though, Fulton County, they were almost welcoming of the results because they felt like it brought attention to an issue that they've been working on for a long time. Fulton County is one of the only local governments, at least in Georgia or in the South, that does have an environmental justice sort of program at the local government level, and it was concurring with the evidence that they had, and so they responded well. I'm not sure what I would have done differently except maybe extended the timeline between the time that the report came out and when it was actually released, and maybe had been able to spend more time with the community leaders. Unfortunately, because of I wanted to get it out once the results were out and it was written and we had given it out to people that we felt like had the right to see it in advance. We wanted to get it out so that it could be effective. So.
Excellent. I'm just looking at the time. I want to maybe do 2 more comments or questions. This is more of a comment. I don't know if you'll have any reaction to it, but it says, the person is saying here, well, the green law system might be most useful for evaluating existing law enforcement if the number of violations per year is what is used. This report can push the evaluation of whether that is a good legal marker to use, especially if the goal is improvement of public health. I don't know if you have any reaction to that.
I mean, I'm happy to hear that. I think that that's true, or at least there are questions that can be asked based on the data. So, for instance, I would like to know, and this is a conversation that Nick and I have had, and I don't know if we've really gone as in depth with it as we can, is what are the different enforcement rates? Are violations being enforced in in higher income areas in a different way than they are in lower income areas? Does it take 10 violations before there actually is an enforcement action by the state or federal government in those areas? How can we respond to violations that are not being enforced, or there's not a state agency action that's happening? So I think it does raise some interesting questions about the law and about the way that the government enforces them, and how we can use GIS data to create a fuller picture. Because there's really not as far as I've seen, there are, I think now EPA has some enforcement mapping systems that you can use, but for us at least, we wanted something that was localized and really gave a full picture over a certain amount of time.
And I'm just going to combine these last two questions. The comment here is, this is a nice tool that identifies hotspots, but how would it be applied to the location of a new permitted facility? Do you target the cold spots? And I'll just combine it with the other question, kind of similar. I mean, not similar, but thinking about the practical applications. What other practical applications do you envision for this tool?
So let's say that a new facility comes into an environmental justice hotspot. You can use the data in the report to make a comment. We have the right to comment on permits at the state and federal level, and we say this area has been identified by a study as being the #1 environmental justice hotspot in the county. There are already 19 air pollution sites within this area, and you already have 15 recorded air pollution violations within this time period. We suggest that you do a more searching review if you're going to approve a permit in this area, and conduct review of these violations that have occurred in this area. It allows us to have that data easily accessible, and at the same time draw attention to the environmental justice issues that we think are important. So it might be helpful to draw more community attention or more media attention to the fact that there's another site that's coming into this area, and say, what is wrong with our laws and policies when there's not at least an expectation that the state agency will consider environmental justice when they approve this permit. When they're putting more facilities in the same area again and again, and we're talking about communities that are the lowest income or are minority communities. Should there be at least some kind of safeguards put in place to not even discourage permitting, but encourage consideration of environmental justice issues. And for us as attorneys, it can certainly be used in a way of kind of targeting the permits that we want to review, because there are so many permits that are issued across the region. How to a small number of attorneys isolate what areas they want to focus on and ensure that the permitting is done correctly and that there aren't a lot of violations in an area. So hopefully that at least answers part of that question.
Well, I want to say thank you again to David and Nick. We are really grateful for your participation today, for your presentations as part of our webinar series. So what I'd like to do is just say that our next webinar, before I say that, I want to point out that the recording, every webinar that we're doing as part of this series is being recorded and will be posted. An archive file will be posted on the ENSER web page. So for folks who want to look at this again, or for folks who were not able to make it, they can access a recording of the webinar through the ENSER web page. Our next webinar will be held Wednesday, March 20th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, and will feature a presentation by Douglas Crawford Brown, who is currently Professor and Director of the Cambridge Center for Climate Change Mitigation Research. and the title for the March webinar is A Semi-Quantitative Framework for Cumulative Risk Assessment of Waterborne Contaminants. I'm particularly excited about this one because a lot of the work around cum risk tends to focus in the data-rich arena of air pollution. I mean, it's just a really rich data area, and we're really happy to have someone come speak about water, something a little bit different. Also, as a reminder, you all will be receiving an email invitation to complete an online survey about today's webinar. Your feedback provides us valuable insight into how we might improve our logistics, identification of potential discussion topics for future webinars, and ensures that we're meeting your needs. So once again, I want to say thanks to David and Nick, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.